also, because I want to teach you guys some stuff about the Twin Cities, why the streets are laid out the way they are, give you guys some information about that. And I have, first of all, if anyone wants to volunteer, I have audience evaluation forms, and what those are is you guys are basically going to grade me on my speech, so please give me good grades.
Okay.
So anyone who wants to do these, just raise your hand and I can pass them out to you. Or otherwise, or yeah, maybe that'd be better because I would have a hard time figuring it out. And then, if you have any questions about the evaluations, just how to fill them out or anything, they're just asking you to kind of check mark different qualities of like my body language and how I present everything, and then just write some comments at the bottom, just saying what you guys thought.
And I'm going to ask that you keep them face down so that you're not reading that instead of listening. Okay? You can think this after the speech is done.
How well do you guys know Twin Cities and where you guys live? Do you know it pretty well? You live in, most of you live in Minneapolis? Yeah. All right. Well, if you're a resident of Minneapolis and St. Paul, you're going to see that there are layers on top of layers of development and technology that's come from the settled periods of the early 1800s into the later 1900s. I lived in North Minneapolis and I've lived in St. Paul for over 10 years, so I know both cities very well. I also studied at the University of Minnesota Geography of the Twin Cities under Judith Martin, so I got some really good insight into why the Twin Cities are laid out the way they are, the development over the past 150 years of development. Today I'm going to summarize the history and development of the Twin Cities and the urban street grid. All the streets you guys might live on or spend time on, they're laid out for a certain reason. And first I'm going to discuss with you guys about how the Twin Cities were originally settled. First of all, Minneapolis was settled because people used to use the waterways and the rivers to get around on boats and canoes. So when they originally came up here, they saw that there were the Falls of St. Anthony in downtown Minneapolis, and they used the waterfall to generate power to mill flour and also to generate electricity when electricity came about. Originally, when the cities were settled, the downtown areas, like this would be an example of the river cutting through either of the downtowns. Most of the streets and the houses were clustered really closely, and the streets were laid out to line up with the river. So there were apartment buildings, housing that was grouped close together. There would be mills and places for people to work right along the riverside, and the people's residences and tenements would be close by because people got around on foot back then. They didn't just take cars, obviously, because it was like 1890, they didn't have cars around then. And then there were stagecoaches if you could afford it. There were trains which were developed in the later 1800s, so people could get from city to city. Like if they're going to downtown St. Paul, you could take a train to St. Paul or to Chicago or to somewhere far away. Otherwise, thank you very much. Otherwise, you were confined to a smaller space, so the development was compact, clustered, and close by. Everything was close by. There were people from New England and the East that came in and they set up different factories and industries for people to live in. People came here to work, and people used the waterways and foot transportation to get around. As the advent time passed by, streetcars came about and became the dominant technology, and that's what you see nowadays with the way the blocks are lined up, the square blocks and the street grid system. That's a result of the streetcars. There's a gentleman named Thomas Lowry. He introduced the streetcars to the Twin Cities, and if you guys know Lowry Avenue, that's right up on the north side up here, that's named after Thomas Lowry. And what they did is, since these were originally oriented, this would be north, south, west, and east, the streets were originally oriented to go alongside the river. Well, with streetcars, they were able to make the grid a north, south, east, west pattern. So when they made all these avenues, like they straightened out Hennepin Avenue, so it went straight south, and then it crosses the river and heads east. West Broadway was west, northwest, or east-west rather, and crossed the river. There's a river bridge there and turns into Broadway. And so all the streets were lined up in a square grid pattern which was also classically a democratic way to divide up the lots in the residential areas, because everybody had the same amount of land when they bought a house back then. So then these little nodes of intersections, like pretend this is Franklin Avenue and this is Hennepin, people would build stores at the nodes of the intersections because that's where the streetcar would stop. So if you notice, there'll be a four-way intersection, you'll see commercial stores and buildings on each corner. That was accommodating to the streetcar era of back then. And according to Judith Martin and Landgren, who wrote a book called The History of the Residents of the Twin Cities, they discussed how the streetcars basically laid the foundation of the road system we have today, and how the wealthy people, as they made money, they moved further and further out to the fringe areas, and then the middle classes followed them out, and so they continued to build streetcar lines to create the grid system we see today. As time went on, highways and freeways were invented. The automobile became the predominant form of transportation. And once that became the matter of fact way to get about, streetcars were dismantled. They completely tore up all the tracks for the streetcar system. They switched over to buses because Detroit had a big auto industry at the time, and they were going to every city pushing people to build buses instead of taking streetcars. So with that, highways were built and freeways were built. That meant people could move further and further out from the urban core and from the grid. And people began to move further out because they wanted more land, they wanted more space. They no longer were dependent on a streetcar or a grid street system. So as that happened, they left the middle of the city empty, and urban decay and urban blight started. That's when people stopped wanting to settle and they wanted to live far out in the bedroom communities and just work in the city. And for a long time, there were areas of the city that were not as economically prosperous as they used to be. And also, like even some areas now, they're better, like Franklin Avenue, Phillips neighborhood in South Minneapolis used to be an example of an area that was sort of blighted, it was sort of dangerous. There weren't a lot of people putting businesses in there. And since then, there's been a return to the city movement beginning in the late 70s, where people started resettling back into the urban centers because gas prices like now, they're $3.49 a gallon. People don't want to pay that much to drive from an hour away to get into the city. And with light rail transit, upgraded electric bus systems, people are finally starting to resettle back in the city. And the areas we see now are being redeveloped, new buildings are going up, new opportunities are coming within the urban core for everybody. So with that, I'm going to close, you guys, and I hope that you learned something about the Twin Cities, why they're laid out the way they are. And if you guys have any questions, I can answer them for you. What's your question?
How did you learn all this?
I went to college, I went to the university and took a class on it. And they taught us a lot about it. We had to do a project where we drove all over the Twin Cities. We had to study each neighborhood and what kind of housing was there, why it was the way it was, and to be observant. So it's pretty cool to learn all that. Because now, when you guys are all walking around, you're going to be able to look at things and kind of get somewhat of an idea why they are the way they are. So, what are you back there?
Was this back in those days or right now?
This is, well, I went from back in the days until right now. Back in the days, it was a lot different because people were more segregated, and like certain sections of the city were kind of reserved. Like actually, North Minneapolis used to be a predominantly Jewish neighborhood way back a long time ago because Jews were ostracized from the commercial community. And then as they moved further out to the suburbs, it became more of an African American neighborhood. And now, as African Americans move out to the suburbs, there's more of a mixture coming in the area. So I mean, that's always how it goes. There's a pattern of development where in the past, people couldn't really choose as much where they lived because there were so many prejudices that if you wanted to live in a certain area, they might look at you and say, well, we don't want this person in our neighborhood or something like that. Where now, there's a lot more mobility. People have more opportunities. There's still some of that stuff that exists, but it's not like it was before where they would turn you down just based on your religion or your race or something like that, which is completely wrong and unjust. All right, yeah.
Two things. One, I remember when we used to drive around and look at the different houses and
You helped me with that project,
houses and stuff. And two, if it's okay with Ms. Buckner, can we keep that poster?
It's really quickly drawn, but I mean, if you guys can have it, I don't need it anymore. All right, what's up, man?
What like substitute in there?
I learned it was a class called Geography of the Twin Cities. It was actually a geography class, but they specifically was geography of the Twin Cities area, so they went over a whole bunch of material. It was an intense class. I mean, it was a challenge to get done, especially we had to drive to 70 different intersections, write down what style of housing as far as like Gothic Revival, Renaissance housing. I didn't even understand the different kinds of housing there were. And then after that, you learn what eras produced what kind of housing and why certain areas are the way they are. It was pretty cool.
I thought back in the day they had those little wheel things with the, they build them and then people like riding down the street.
Wagon?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what stagecoaches were. That was early in the development. That's one reason why in the older city, since horses can only get so far so fast, everything was really close together and really compacted. Because it's not like a car where you just jump in your car, fill up the tank, and boom, you're 4 hours away. Back then they were really limited, and trains only went really long distances.
So back in the day, they didn't have cars, they had more trains.
Yeah, trains were the main, if you wanted to go long distance, trains were the predominant way to get anywhere. Like as far as people would take a train from New York to Chicago and then one up here, or they would take one from Seattle, Washington, west through the Dakotas to here. But for shorter distances, trains were a little less common. They had some, like if you wanted to go to Duluth, you could take a train back then. If you wanted to go to Rochester, you could take a train. But like if you were going from, they didn't really have suburbs when it was back in the days where there were trains. There were just little kind of small towns out there. They had trains that went out there also, but if you were in the city, you more or less walked, biked, or you took a stagecoach or a horse.
How did they name the streets?
They named them after all kinds of different things. Actually, in Minneapolis, the streets are named, they're alphabetized. So if you know, actually, if you look at North Minneapolis here, if you go off West Broadway and head west, you're going to see Aldrich. I can't remember what the B one is. Bryant, yep, Colfax, DuPont, Emerson, Fremont, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, because that makes sense. It's easy for people to know.
And like, oh, in like Chicago, their streets doesn't go ABC, they go in like
Number.
Yeah, that's all it was. I'm from Hibbing, Minnesota originally. That's all we had. Is we had numbers. We had first, second, third, fourth, north, first, second, third, fourth, south. So we go by the number grid also.
How long did it take you?
To do this speech,
No, like how long did it take you to learn all of this?
it took a semester, which is half the school year. And it was a lot. And it, you know, we had to go to class for 2 hours every day. It was a huge class, and they lectured, and then we had to do studies. And we had to write huge reports, I mean like 20-page reports. So it was pretty tough. But at the same time, it's nice to have that knowledge, and it comes in handy sometimes, you know, definitely.
What if you like missed the class? Like,
Well, you know, in college, if you miss a class, they're not like going to babysit you. So if you miss a class, they don't care, but then your grade might suffer as a result of that. You won't get your points for participating in class that day. And then if you take a test and there was something in the material that you didn't learn, then you might get a lower grade on the test. Because you're paying for college, so you know they don't care if you show up or not. They get your money either way. So
when y'all gotta write like pages like this whole page.
yeah, the reports there are pretty insane. They're usually, and you have to just cite and do research where you actually do a citation where you look it up. You look up who wrote something, what book it comes from, then you have to reference it within the material so that they know that you have credibility, so they know that what you're saying is true and not just something you made up. You guys will learn that throughout high school. They'll teach you all that stuff. You'll be prepared to do it once you're in college, more than likely.
Other questions? Are there other questions? Albert says.
does that mean you have to do it like, so like you need like 20 pages, right? Would that be like a whole entire like essay or something?
Yeah, depending on what you're doing, if you do a report, a lot of times it'll be like that. It's double spaced sometimes, so it's not as bad as if it was like all crowded together. But they expect a lot out of you because when you're done with that, you can make good money. If you stick it out for 2 to 4 years in college, you can usually increase your wealth by that way.
You know,
Yeah, they give you time to do it. They usually give you, you know, they'll say, they'll give you a syllabus, it's called. It's a list of all your assignments throughout the year. And then, so you'll know ahead of time. They expect you to be responsible for yourself when you're in college. They'll remind you, but they don't expect you to, you know, they're not gonna tell you every day, hey, remember this is due tomorrow. They'll just, you know, if you don't do it, you don't do it, and you won't get the points. All right. One more from you, Bianca, and then we're gonna close out, so you guys
In
can go to school.
college, like, can you turn the stuff in late?
You can, but you'll lose points on it. Like, I accidentally forgot an assignment somehow, actually, for this class, to be honest, and I knew that I made a mistake and I had to just turn it in late, but that's one thing, is they'll have a 5 to 10% loss of points a lot of times when you turn in something late. Then you learn next time not to do it, because if you lose the points, then you know not to do it in the future. Yep.
What is one day like?
Sometimes they'll be not, they can be lenient. Sometimes they won't take points off if you do a good job, or if you show that you're honestly concerned in the class. All right.
Like what kind of concert you went to?
I went back to college because I went before for a little while, but when Bianca was really young, I had to take care of her, so I couldn't finish it. So now I'm in my 30s, going back to college is challenging because it's a lot different now than it was when I was younger. Like with all the computer stuff, it's different. So I'm an old guy in college. All right.
Listen up.
All right.
What if you were like sick?
Then you just have to make it up and just do. The best thing you do is communicate with your teacher and tell them you're sick. Just be upfront and say, I'm sick, I'm not going to this class, and they'll usually accommodate you. If you're not making excuses all the time, if you're always making excuses about things, then they might look at it differently. It's a case-by-case basis. Even like here, I'm sure it's similar where your teacher will know if you guys are, honestly giving effort or if you're not. They know the difference. All right, last question. I have to wrap it up, so you guys have.
What business are you trying to do?
Web development. So I'll be the person who lays out web pages, not a designer, but I lay out web pages and help do the code. Like every computer language, or a bunch of different languages and codes. When you see a web page that comes up, there's a whole bunch of code that's involved in building that. But part of that is I have to do these public presentations, because when I'm doing presentations at work, I'll be explaining to people how their websites are going to work, so I have to be able to speak in a public setting and say, hey, this web page is going to have to start with this page, this is going to be the home page, this is going to be the index. So that's why. But thank you guys very much. I appreciate you guys listening and helping me out to get through school.
You're welcome.